And we are live. Thank you so very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us on our 17th MatchPoint webinar, where we'll be learning about Puerto Rico as a business and investment destination. We apologize for being a little bit late. We had some technical issues that we thankfully were able to overcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Danny Vargas, National Director for the Latino Coalition. And on behalf of the Latino Coalition, we are thankful for your support. We hope to educate, to inspire, and to guide all business owners, entrepreneurs, and members of the Latino Coalition with our webinars. We really want to thank our sponsor, Wells Fargo, for their support in helping to make this series possible. So thank you very much, Wells Fargo. In case you didn't know, we have this monthly webinar series available for free that highlights important information for small business owners. And soon we'll be rolling out a new podcast series. So keep checking back for more information and please join us for those as well. I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Jorge Salichs. Jorge is a corporate and government affairs attorney who specializes in corporate law, economic incentives, opportunity zones, commercial contracts, advisory, and government affairs. Jorge has built a very successful niche practice advising companies and investors seeking to take advantage of Puerto Rico's corporate tax incentives and investment opportunities, and actively advocates for and promotes the multiple economic development initiatives being carried out in Puerto Rico. Jorge advises clients on corporate structuring, capital formation, mergers and acquisition, joint ventures, corporate finance, real estate transactions, and so much more. He's a great lawyer and a dear friend. And in full disclosure, so everybody knows, my whole family's from Puerto Rico. So this entire webinar today is going to be really important for me as well. So Jorge, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Danny. And thank you to the Latino Coalition for this opportunity to share some insights as to our daily work at the firm, and hopefully this would create opportunities for everyone and re-engage people and give people ideas as to what possibilities Puerto Rico has for them.
Fantastic. Let's go ahead and share your presentation. Great.
All right.
Take it away, Jorge.
All right. Thank you again. Thank you for everyone for your time. Hopefully this presentation provides some insight as to the opportunities that Puerto Rico offers. Here's a brief summary of the items that we will be discussing today. The plan is to go through them at a steady and fast pace, so that we can get to hopefully some Q&A and perhaps a deeper conversation with Danny about the opportunities he also sees. So we're going to talk a little bit about Puerto Rico, some basic facts about Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico's business landscape, and what the competitive advantage to doing business in Puerto Rico is. And we're going to dive in to the incentives code, which is the main gist of this presentation. Okay, so some basic facts. Puerto Rico, as the majority of people should know, probably know, it's an unincorporated territory of the US. Puerto Ricans are US citizens. There's no passport needed to come into the country. Puerto Rico business operates, on US currency. You have banking that's regulated by the US system, intellectual property protection under US law. You have access, businesses have access to grants, social programs, education, and obviously you get the protection, the presence and the protection of US federal courts in Puerto Rico. So in general, benefits and protections of operating within a US jurisdiction operate in Puerto Rico, and with added benefits, tax benefits in this case, of operating as a foreign corporation for US tax purposes. Without diving in too much into that, the reason that happens is because Puerto Rico, at least for IRS purposes, is considered a foreign corporation. So the US, the federal Internal Revenue Code does not apply. Puerto Rico itself has its own revenue code that allows it to treat some businesses and some industries differently. And that's the purpose of this talk today. Okay, a brief rundown of what Puerto Rico's competitive advantages are. Again, availability of cash grants, financial incentives, a high capacity infrastructure, both in terms of seaport transport, but also in terms of the electric grid, high speed internet, so state of the art telecommunication systems, transportation, major highways throughout the island. And I think most importantly for many folks, in addition to the, obviously telecommunication and wireless capacity and internet capacity, it's workforce. It's a highly educated bilingual workforce that competes with any other country in the world. And in terms of, it's been used quite effectively by a lot of pharma, biopharma, other manufacturing companies, global manufacturing companies that have identified Puerto Rico and its workforce as a key asset in operating in Puerto Rico. A little brief summary of what I just mentioned. Puerto Rico, it's able to treat businesses differently in terms of having its own internal revenue code. I won't get into the nitty gritty of this, but essentially this is what empowers Puerto Rico to either lower or eliminate Puerto Rico local taxes in for some industries, right? And that way actively promote the relocation of some businesses into Puerto Rico. Okay, so this is a basic snapshot of Puerto Rico taxes under normal circumstances, right? For corporations. You have income tax and persons. You have income taxes with a maximum rate of 30%. You have an AMT, alternative minimum tax, right now at 18.5. There is a sales and use tax, so of 7%, municipal license taxes, and then property taxes. Okay, let's dive in. So let me just preface this discussion about the Puerto Rico Incentives Code by mentioning that a little more macro view of this is that Puerto Rico for the last, I would say, 12, 15 years has been pretty aggressively promoting certain industries by way of, special statutes that incentivize, that provide tax incentives and other tax benefits to companies to come to the island and partake in those industries, right? And the reason we're having this discussion about the incentives code, the Puerto Rico Incentives Code, is that because 2.5 years ago, the government did something that was expected for a long time, which was to aggregate that amalgam of tax incentive statutes into one incentives code. So, and it pretty much provided and gave chapters of the different industries that are being incentivized. So we'll go over some of them, that we find the most important or most popular ones. Okay, so here's a brief snapshot of the different tax incentive laws that are now consolidated into one incentives code. You've got mostly export of trade and services, resident individual investors, which are the two main ones that we'll be talking about today. But there's also a huge chapter on international financial entities. There's also a big important chapter on manufacturing incentives to manufacture products on the island, all types of products. And then obviously there are some other industries that are being aggressively promoted, like renewable energy, creative industries, entrepreneurship, etc. Okay, so these are the highlights of the incentives code in many of its facets. This is a good summary of what most of the tax incentives under the different statutes are. It's providing companies with a 4% flat income tax on their revenue, on their Puerto Rico sourced revenue, 0% distribution 0% tax on distributions, right? On dividends that the company pays to its shareholders. 75% property tax exemption, 75% exemption on construction taxes, different exemptions on municipal taxes and on patent and on municipal patent exemptions. Okay, now this is important to note, is that all of these incentives operate under the umbrella of a tax decree. Now, what is that in layman terms? It's essentially a contract with the Puerto Rico government. You must apply and state your case to the government of what industry you're in and what your company is trying to do. Build your case in terms of the employment that you will bring to the areas, the type of employees, growth projections, essentially building a case for the government that, hey, the government wants you to come to the island and do this work from the island, right? And so in order for you to get those preferential tax rate, you have to apply to this for this tax decree exemption, and you have to obtain it, right? So it's a process. It's not as simple as filing and from day one, you're automatically going to benefit from those incentives. It takes a process. It's an application that you have to build and convince the government to give you this type of tax decree exemption. Right. So going into the first one that we'll cover today, which is the Individual Investors Act. It is formally known, if you research, you'll find a lot of literature under Act 22, which was its name that it was given to it before. Now it's all consolidated into Act 60, which is the chapter, which is the new incentives code. It's lost that name of Act 22, but a lot of the research that you will do about it, you will find that it was formerly referred to as Act 22. Okay, so essentially, in a nutshell, this is a statute that promotes and wants individual investors, mostly high net worth individuals, to come to the island, to move to the island, to start a new family, to start a family on the island, essentially to relocate, to move their tax residency to Puerto Rico, right? Now it has to be a bona fide move. It can be, it can be just on paper. It has to be a bona fide move. There are some requirements, and I'll just mention real quick what the exemption is. It's essentially for those individuals that move their tax residency to Puerto Rico, they are going to be given a 0% tax rate on dividend income, interest income, and certain capital gains. So essentially, this is a statute that's directed at individuals, high net worth individuals that derive most of their income from passive sources, right? From dividend income from companies, from interest income, that type of revenue stream. Now, going through some of the requirements, you have to be a new resident, and you must not have been a resident of Puerto Rico at any time between January 2006 and January 2012. There's a small annual contribution of $10K for a local nonprofit. Individuals must evidence the acquisition of a home, and essentially a bunch of different requirements that you'll see typically under the IRS bona fide tax residency move, and we'll run through some of them. Surely. Okay. I discussed this already. Okay, so the section 933 of the U.S. Code states that the following individuals shall not be included. The following should not be included in gross income in gross income and shall be exempt from federal taxation, right? And it pretty much gives you the basis for how this type of move works. But in order, the key part about this slide is that Puerto Rico pretty much you models the IRS code as to the 3 different tests that it's going to look at for you to become an actual bona fide new resident in Puerto Rico. We won't go over all of them, but essentially, again, to recap, it's a bona fide move. You have to buy a property. If you have kids, they have to be in school in Puerto Rico, local affiliation to church, charities, whatnot. You have to be in Puerto Rico. One other thing that I'll mention about this this particular statute. It requires you to live in Puerto Rico, and as I said, to move your tax residency to Puerto Rico, and spend in Puerto Rico. I believe be in Puerto Rico for at least half of the year. I think it's 183 days it comes out to. As long as you live in Puerto Rico for half plus 1 day, you're in compliance. So many folks have different properties and want to live outside Puerto Rico for some time. That's all well, as long as you fulfill the requirement of a bona fide move. Next slide. Went over some of these things. These are essentially the sourcing rules that allow for all these things to be taxed preferentially: capital gains, dividends, interest, as I mentioned. Okay, so once again, summarizing, what will be 100% tax exempted: income from dividends, interest, income from short and long-term capital gains, and most importantly, in the world that we're living now, income from cryptocurrency and other crypto-based assets. Okay, so here is a useful slide for many folks. Essentially, it's giving you a snapshot comparison of your situation if you're just an average U.S. resident, or if you move to Puerto Rico and operate, your same, the same business from Puerto Rico with Act 60 resident investors tax exemption. So you'll see that most folks pay between 40 to 40 something percent federal and tax income taxes. Then you take state dividend tax rates and you add all those up, and it's a big number, right? And if you move to Puerto Rico, all those go to zero, right? You want to take a picture or something, that's something that we can discuss more in detail. All right, I think we're ready to move on to the next topic. So the next statute, it's very interesting to many because it involves the ability for you to start a business in Puerto Rico to export a product or a service from Puerto Rico. This one does not require you to make your move to Puerto Rico. This is just, a corporate tax on businesses that will be applying to this tax exemption decree under Act 20 and receiving this exemption and operating a business from which they export to the world, Latin America, US, anywhere, as long as the company is based in Puerto Rico and from Puerto Rico is exporting those products and services. Okay, so now who's eligible? So any entity or any natural person with a bona fide office in Puerto Rico can perform those eligible services, and we'll talk about what those eligible industries and services are shortly, from Puerto Rico to an outside market. Prior to the new incentives code, these tax incentives were limited to corporations, LLCs, partnership, and any other legal person. Now, any entity or natural person can apply for these benefits. The term of this tax exemption grant is 15 years, renewable for additional 15 years. There is an employment commitment of at least one employee when your annual projections, your annual business volume is more than 3 million. If it's not, it's it's not a requirement. It's on a case-by-case basis. But most folks, that are in business are doing more than 3 million. But if you do, there's a requirement of only one employee. Okay, so here's a list of all the different eligible services under this act. As you see, it's a pretty good and pretty wide range of industries. You have law firms, you have engineering firms, you have architecture firms, you have call centers, you have shared services, any types of professional services, essentially, but you also have export of products. Okay. Another basic, very basic illustration of the very basic case scenario. but I think it's useful because it gives people a quick, illustration of the tax rate. So essentially, as I said, it's a 4%. Essentially, if you are operating from Puerto Rico and you're exporting to the world or to the US from Puerto Rico, and you have a tax decree under Act 60 for export of trade of products and services, you are going to be taxed only at 4%, right? So if you take a look at the left, if you're nearshoring, if you're exporting from Florida, Florida's not the best sort of example because there's no state tax in Florida. But even when there be no state tax in Florida, the government is pretty much going to take somewhere around 30 something to 40% of your income from exporting these products and services, right? And even discounting the last bullet, that pretty much applies to when the company has a non-US shareholder, even not subtracting that last 177,000. If you just leave it at $590,000 after state and federal taxes, and you compare that to Puerto Rico, where you're only going to pay 4% tax, and US businesses and persons do not pay federal taxes, that's all the tax liability you'll have. That's quite a difference, quite a savings. It can be a savings of at least $370,000 if I'm doing the math right. Sorry, $470,000. That's quite a big difference. And this is not exaggeration. That's only a tax that you'll be subject to if you have this type of tax decree. The only other, distinction is I'll make is that the only percentage of that income that won't be included in this 4% that will be subject to only regular taxes is, the salary that you will assign yourself or assign an employee. Outside of any salary that you are assigning yourself or employees that you may have in the company, the rest of your Puerto Rico source income revenues will be only taxed at 4%. And that's the only tax you'll be paying. Okay. This is a good, again, illustration of how this works for when the company itself has US resident as a shareholder or has a Puerto Rico resident. If you have, and so this is a good opportunity to bring in an addition to make an additional point, which I sometimes call the double whammy. If you are a company, if you are an investor that moves to Puerto Rico under formerly Act 22 tax exemption decree, right? And you become a new resident of Puerto Rico and you have this tax decree exemption that does not tax you on your passive income, on dividend income, for example, and you go there and you start an export services company with an Act 20 decree, with a tax exemption decree for export of products and services. I call it a double whammy because this is what happens. The company is going to make, let's just say that it makes $1 million, right? Or let's just say, $1 million in annual income. That company with the tax decree is only going to be taxed at 4%, right? The rest, the savings, you can pass to yourself as dividend income, and because you have that Act 22 exemption, they flow through to you without paying taxes, right? So it's quite the lucrative and quite the interesting opportunity for some folks that can apply to both of these tax exemptions. It provides a very interesting tax scenario. And this is kind of the illustration of that. Okay, briefly, after discussing those two tax incentives in play, opportunity zones. I won't spend too much time because this is a very technical area, but I'll just say that opportunity zones are also, Puerto Rico is also included in the opportunity zone federal legislation. And so you'll see why Puerto Rico presents itself as a very interesting opportunity zone destination for folks. So a brief recap for folks that do not know what opportunity zones are. Opportunity zones were created by the US government to encourage growth and long-term investment in specifically economically distressed or underinvested communities. The program essentially provides a federal income tax incentive to an eligible taxpayer, and that's defined by the statute, that makes a timely invested of an eligible gain, essentially a capital gain, in a qualified opportunity fund. The Puerto Rico Internal Revenue Code was amended to provide the same OC federal tax incentives in Puerto Rico. And the good thing about this is that Puerto Rico can also add offer additional incentives that overlay those federal OC incentives. Without getting into much detail, the three main benefits of any jurisdiction, any OZ jurisdiction, including Puerto Rico, is that you have a temporary deferral of your capital gain. If you had a capital gain triggering event in a tax year, you can apply when you're filing your taxes. You can say, no, I am going to invest this capital gains proceeds into a qualified opportunity zone, and it automatically punts that tax liability. You don't have to pay capital gains on those gains yet. Right. The second benefit is that it gives you a step up in your basis for those capital gains. And this is, in layman terms, essentially is that if you invest that capital gain into a qualified opportunity zone fund, and you hold an investment in that fund for at least 5 years, the amount that you'll pay in capital gains will be reduced by 10%. If you hold those funds in that qualified opportunity zone fund for 2 more years, so a total of 7, that capital gain amount is going to be reduced by 15%, a total of 15%, so 5% more. And the last benefit, which I find it's the most beneficial, is that when you invest those capital gain funds into a qualified opportunity zone fund and leave it there for at least 10 years, any appreciation of those funds that you invested in the fund, say that the fund invested in real estate, in a nice hotel in an underinvested community, and that hotel now is valued at 10x, right? And any appreciation of your capital gains invested in that fund is going to be tax-free, right, after 10 years. So if you if you scale that and say into many, many multiples of millions, then you're talking about a significant benefit. Okay, so what's the opportunity in Puerto Rico, right? No pun intended. Why do I bring it up? This is why. Puerto Rico itself, almost entirely, 97% of Puerto Rico is considered an opportunity zone. So many of these benefits, right, that are only available to eligible tax payers in the U.S. in certain zip codes, if you will, and some of them are not necessarily where these businesses want to be because of access. They want to be closer to a hub or easy transportation, manufacturing sites that want to have larger type of complexes because they have many needs. Puerto Rico doesn't have the limitation. Essentially, you can even have like beachfront opportunity zone developments in Puerto Rico that qualify for this legislation. So that's a big advantage for Puerto Rico. And these are some of the particularities about the tax incentives of opportunity zones in Puerto Rico. I won't go discuss the details right now. I want to fly through some of these. Okay, so additional incentives that we cover just very briefly. Manufacturing tax incentives. So all those tax incentives were existing before and are now aggregated into the incentive code. This is a very popular tax incentive statute because it's been in the works in Puerto Rico for a long time. There are many manufacturing sites in Puerto Rico, many different industries that manufacture products, daily products that you use in your daily lives that are manufactured in Puerto Rico. And a great chunk of them operate with these tax incentives. Okay. These are some of the tax benefits for the renewables industry in Puerto Rico. It's a 25-year decree, paying 4% tax on income derived from eligible activities. And again, huge exemptions from property tax and municipal license tax, an exemption from sales and use tax on certain items. Another popular tax incentive category, it's international financial entities. Okay, go through some of that. Some of the activities allowed under these this particular statute: financial services to foreign person, asset management, alternate investment management, management of private capital investment activities, etc. There are some restrictions with respect to capital, to employment, etc. There are some employee requirements. You have to have at least 4 employees in Puerto Rico. Again, won't go into any of the details here in this presentation because of the time constraints. If you have any questions to that, you can direct it to us after this webinar. Okay, brief disclaimer about our firm. This presentation is not written to be used or intended to be used and cannot be used by any taxpayer for purposes of avoiding U.S. federal income tax penalties. And that's it.
So, Jorge, I had to, so I've got a couple of questions for you, but more than anything else, it's just the amount of incentives and savings and benefits that you described are incredible. In fact, some of our viewers might be asking themselves, it's almost too good to be true. Right. So can you just confirm that this is all real and available today? This is legit.
This is all real and available today. And the most important thing, Danny, is that particularly in these troubling times where we're living, where like there seem, because of the pandemic, because of other issues around the world, where sometimes products become in high demand, and there's a shortage of supply, and we as a nation have for years depended on foreign countries to produce some raw materials, to have adequate supply chain setups for us to have products and services in this nation. Puerto Rico is not foreign. Puerto Rico is an option for these companies to set up under a U.S. jurisdiction and under the U.S. flag. And in these times where the U.S. is getting a little bit back into promoting that U.S. companies establish themselves in the U.S. and that we somehow find a way to be less reliant on and subject to those sort of restrictions, this is a perfect opportunity because Puerto Rico is the USA.
I love it. So if someone wanted to take advantage of these, particularly setting up a company and take advantage of those types of opportunities, how long might it take to actually set up an entity to begin the process?
The process it's pretty turnkey. What we always tell folks, depending on the complexity of your case, because again, some of these so these tax exemption opportunities are available under government websites and for you to apply online. The key thing is that we advise that you always consult with preferably a local attorney and a local accountant, depending on the complexity of your situation and of your business, because as I mentioned before, when you're applying for these tax exemption decrees, you are competing, right? You want to build your case. You want to make sure that you're presenting a strong case with strong financial pro forma projections, and that you need to convince the government to tax you at this preferential rate and not another competitor, right? So there may be a few people that want to be in the same line of business that you in. So because that's the case, in our experience, and it's gonna sound a little self-serving. I'm not necessarily promoting that you contact us, but what I am saying is that you should, depending on the complexity of your case, at least speak to a local accountant and a local attorney to guide you through the process, ask those relevant questions that may, be important when you're making that decision.
In fact, you just answered my next question, which was, if somebody wants to do this, what's the first thing they should do? And the first thing they should do is contact probably a local attorney who's got the experience of being able to move forward with this and do it successfully. Which, speaking of success, from your perspective, from your vantage point, how's it going? Have you seen an increase in companies, using these options, taking advantage of these opportunities?
Huge increase. I would say, especially after, so it had been growing. These statutes have been in place ever since, I want to say 2012, when Governor Fortuño was in government. But we've seen, and so slowly and steadily, there had been an increase in attention to the matter for 3 or 4 years. But I want to say ever since the coronavirus, well, even before, even when Island was hit with a list of hurricanes and earthquakes and whatnot, a lot of federal funding started coming into the island to aid in the recovery. And so a lot of U.S. companies that were in that line of industry as well saw the opportunity to move to Puerto Rico to do some good, and pretty much stayed after and applied to some of these incentives. And not to mention, the pandemic brought an explosion of interest because many folks now just want to live where they work, want to live and work in somewhere that they're comfortable in. We don't have this mandate now, right, to work at a specific site. And so if you could work from anywhere in the world, why wouldn't you choose Puerto Rico, right?
I agree. Some of the best food in the world too. Let's not forget about that.
Absolutely.
Jorge, I want to thank you for your time and presenting all this valuable information. Can you give us your contact information just in case someone wants to be able to get a hold of you?
Absolutely. I think I'm going to put it right here. Some information about our firm, some of our memberships, some of our qualifications and awards. All right, there you go. So I'm off counsel at Carrasquillo Law Group, which is a boutique corporate and securities law firm with offices in New York. We have offices in Washington, D.C. We have offices in San Francisco, Miami, and Puerto Rico. We also have a small government affairs team based in D.C. to handle any and all issues in government affairs, whether it be federal funding, whether it be tax policy, any tax policy advocacy work, that sort of work. It's what the DC office does. And then here is for those technologically advanced viewers, there's a QR code that you can scan, and it'll lead you to our firm and our published reports and inside reports. A lot of information is included in our website for you to check out.
Fantastic.
Once again, thank you for your time, Danny, and the Latino Coalition for the opportunity.
Excellent. So for those of you that are just listening on audio, it's Jorge@carrasquillolaw.com is the best and easiest way to get a hold of Jorge for all of this incredibly valuable information. Thank you again so much for sharing with us information on business and investment opportunities in Puerto Rico. So important for all of our business owners and investors to be able to have this information at their fingertips. This webinar has been incredibly informative, and I hope all of our business owners, entrepreneurs, and members of the audience have taken some valuable information from this presentation. Jorge, one more time, what's your email address? Jorge@carrasquillolaw.com. Fantastic. And on behalf of the Latino Coalition, thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please join us for future webinars and podcasts. Please keep an eye out for information on our upcoming legislative summit as well. I want to thank again Jorge for joining us and being our guest speaker today. I want to thank all of you for joining us. And as always, be safe, aim high, and thrive. Until next time, see you later.